Imagine driving across Saudi Arabia expecting nothing but endless sand, only to find something that shouldn't be there. Trees. Not just a few scattered plants, but stretches of green appearing across landscapes once defined by dust, rock, and extreme heat. So I came here to investigate one question: is Saudi Arabia really turning its desert into a forest?
When I first arrived in Saudi Arabia, I expected the landscape to tell a familiar story. Heat, rock, sand, long stretches of almost nothing. But in several parts of the country, that story is beginning to change.
Roads that once crossed completely barren landscapes now pass patches of vegetation. Seasonal valleys can suddenly turn green after rainfall, and new trees are being planted across areas where natural forests are extremely rare. At first, it looked like an ordinary environmental project. Saudi Arabia has enormous resources, ambitious development plans, and plenty of reasons to plant trees. But the deeper I looked, the stranger the story became. Because this isn't simply about planting trees. The country is attempting something much larger, restoring vegetation across a landscape where water has always been the limiting factor.
And that raises a difficult question. How do you create forests in one of the driest regions on Earth? To find the answer, I had to leave the cities behind. Because the real story wasn't happening among Saudi Arabia's skyscrapers. It was happening out in the desert. Saudi Arabia is enormous, and its landscapes are far more varied than the endless dunes people often imagine.
There are rocky plateaus, mountain ranges, gravel plains, ancient valleys, coastal environments, and enormous sandy deserts. And some of these landscapes can change dramatically when rain arrives. In the southwest, particularly around the mountains of Asir, rainfall can support vegetation that looks completely out of place compared with the country's famous deserts. Here, the landscape can become surprisingly green during wetter periods. But this revealed something important. Saudi Arabia isn't trying to make every square kilometer look like a European forest. The goal is far more complicated. It's about restoring vegetation where conditions allow it, protecting existing ecosystems, expanding tree cover, and reducing the damage caused by erosion and land degradation. And then I discovered the scale of the ambition. Under Saudi Arabia's Saudi Green Initiative, the country has announced plans to plant billions of trees and restore millions of hectares of degraded land.
Suddenly, the question changed. I wasn't asking whether trees could grow in Saudi Arabia. I was asking whether they could grow at a scale large enough to change the landscape itself. But there was one problem that couldn't be ignored. Every tree needs water. And in Saudi Arabia, water is precisely what the desert doesn't give easily.
To understand why this matters, I had to go much further back. Because today's Saudi landscape isn't simply the result of modern development. The Arabian Peninsula has experienced enormous environmental changes throughout its geological and climatic history. There were periods when parts of Arabia were considerably wetter than they are today. Ancient lakes once occupied regions that are now dry. Rivers and wetlands existed across parts of the peninsula. And evidence of ancient human movement suggests that early populations were able to travel through landscapes that were far more favorable to life than the desert we recognize today. But over thousands of years, climate patterns changed. The peninsula gradually became much drier. Vegetation retreated. Water became concentrated in fewer locations. And eventually, the enormous deserts we know today dominated much of the region.
That history is important because it destroys a common assumption. A green Arabian Peninsula isn't completely unimaginable. The landscape has been greener before. But there's a huge difference between ancient climate change and modern tree planting.
Ancient vegetation depended on natural rainfall patterns that developed over thousands of years. Modern restoration projects have to work within today's climate. And that makes the challenge much harder. A tree planted in a desert isn't simply fighting heat. Its roots are competing for limited moisture. Young trees can die before they ever become established. Poorly chosen species can consume resources without creating a sustainable ecosystem.
So the real question isn't, can we plant trees? It's, can we create vegetation that survives without constantly fighting the environment? And that question leads directly to the most surprising part of this story.
The twist is that the most important part of turning a desert green may not actually be the tree. It may be the water system beneath it. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in technologies for managing water, improving irrigation efficiency, recycling wastewater, and supporting vegetation in environments where rainfall alone isn't enough. And this changes the equation. Instead of asking nature to provide everything, humans are creating controlled conditions where vegetation has a chance to establish itself. But there is another problem. Planting billions of trees sounds impressive. Yet a forest isn't simply a collection of trees. A real ecosystem needs soil, microorganisms, native plants, insects, birds, water cycles, and time. That's why restoration scientists increasingly focus on choosing species that belong in the local environment rather than simply selecting the fastest growing tree available. Native vegetation can be better adapted to heat, drought, and local soil conditions. And when vegetation returns, it can begin creating its own effects. Roots help stabilize soil. Plants reduce wind erosion. Vegetation can provide shade. Organic material can improve soil conditions. And over time, a healthier landscape can become more capable of supporting additional life. But here's where I found the biggest misconception. Saudi Arabia isn't trying to cover the entire country with a giant wall of trees. That would be environmentally unrealistic.
The real goal is a mosaic of restored landscapes. Forests where forests make sense. Grasslands where grasslands belong. Protected habitats. Revived vegetation corridors. And greener urban spaces. And that distinction matters. Because the success of this experiment won't be measured by how many trees are planted. It will be measured by how many survive.
And this is where the story becomes much bigger than Saudi Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula sits in one of the world's harshest climatic regions. Temperatures can become extreme, rainfall is highly variable, and desertification can threaten soil, vegetation, and biodiversity. Restoring land could therefore provide benefits that go beyond simply making the landscape look greener. Vegetation can help reduce soil erosion, trees can provide shade, healthy ecosystems can create habitats for wildlife, and restoring degraded land can help protect landscapes that are increasingly under pressure. But there is also a human dimension. Saudi Arabia's population and cities are growing rapidly. More development means more infrastructure, more demand for resources, and more pressure on the environment. Greener cities could potentially reduce heat exposure and create more comfortable public spaces. And this is one reason Saudi Arabia has connected environmental restoration to its broader Vision 2030 transformation. The ambition isn't only economic. It's also about changing how the country interacts with its environment. But there's an uncomfortable contradiction. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's driest countries, yet some of its environmental ambitions require enormous amounts of water. That means every successful project has to answer the same question: where does the water come from? Desalination can provide fresh water, but it requires energy and infrastructure. Recycled wastewater can reduce pressure on freshwater resources, but it requires treatment systems. Efficient irrigation can reduce waste, but it cannot eliminate water requirements completely.
So turning desert green isn't simply a battle against sand. It's a balancing act between ecology, technology, economics, and water. And that balance could ultimately determine whether this extraordinary experiment succeeds.
Standing in a landscape where green vegetation appears against a background of dry mountains and desert, it's tempting to think the future has already arrived. But it hasn't. The hardest part of restoration isn't planting the first tree. It's keeping the landscape alive for decades. A newly planted tree can look like progress in a photograph, but if it dies after a few years, the photograph meant very little. This is why Saudi Arabia's experiment is so fascinating. It's testing whether modern technology can help restore ecosystems without completely overriding the natural limits of the environment. And there are lessons here for countries far beyond the Middle East. Around the world, drylands are facing pressure from climate change, overgrazing, groundwater depletion, urban expansion, and soil degradation. Many countries are asking the same question: can damaged landscapes be restored? Saudi Arabia is attempting one answer. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the future isn't about making deserts disappear. Perhaps it's about learning where green landscapes can naturally exist and helping them survive. That is a very different idea. Instead of fighting the desert everywhere, restoration can focus on strategic areas, mountain ecosystems, wadis, agricultural boundaries, urban environments, wildlife corridors, and degraded land where vegetation has a realistic chance of surviving. And if those areas become connected, something interesting can happen. Not a single giant forest, but a network of healthier ecosystems spread across an enormous country. That could influence biodiversity, soil stability, local temperatures, and the way people experience the landscape. But there is still one question I couldn't escape. When we look at Saudi Arabia becoming greener, are we witnessing the beginning of a new environmental era? As I left the greener landscapes behind, I kept thinking about that first question: can a desert become a forest? After everything I had seen, the answer wasn't as simple as yes or no. Saudi Arabia isn't transforming its entire desert into a forest, and it probably shouldn't. The real story is more subtle. It's about restoring places where life can return, protecting ecosystems that already exist, using technology carefully, and learning how to work with an environment instead of simply trying to defeat it. Because a desert isn't an empty landscape. It has its own ecology, its own limits, and its own history. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this: green doesn't automatically mean healthy. A landscape can look greener and still be unsustainable. The real achievement would be creating ecosystems that can survive long after the people who planted them are gone. And that leaves me with one final question: if Saudi Arabia succeeds, how much of the desert will humanity be able to restore, and where should we stop?